Ladies and gentlemen, dear visitors of the Lingner Foundation, I'm delighted to see you here today for a lecture that I'm particularly looking forward to. Ksenija Litvinenko will present her ongoing research on Soviet mobile architecture, which is actually, as I learned, not her first time at the Lingner Foundation. She already, in 2018, presents on the Finnish town of Vyborg here. Ksenija Litvinenko is a historian of architecture, architecture in a broad and embedded sense, describing herself as a historian of architecture expertise. She earned her PhD from the University of Manchester, focusing on the, quote, the title of her PhD, Practices of Architecture at the Soviet Theater Design Institute. She also holds an MA and a master degree in comparative history from the Central European University in Budapest in Hungary. And currently she is a associate postdoctoral researcher at the Leibniz Institute for Research in Society and Space in German. It's Institut für raumbezogene Sozialforschung in Erkner. I think you know about this institute. Since December 2023. That's why we also know each other, because we work, are also associated at the same project. Her previous academic engagements include a Visegrad Research Scholarship at the Open Society Archives in Budapest, a fellowship with the Leibniz Research Alliance Values of the Past, and a position as a graduate research scholar at the German Historical Institute in Moscow. Actually, her academic work has been impressively recognized with several scholarships and awards, including the Best Graduate of St. Petersburg University's Award in 2015 and the Hanek Prize of the History Department of the Central European University for the Best MA Thesis of the Year in 2017. Today, Ksenija will present her research on the use of nomadic construction techniques for mobile architectures in the late Soviet Union. These techniques supported temporary relocation, settlement for extractive urbanism, livestock breeding, and workers' recreation. She will examine how construction expertise and architectural practices facilitated state-sponsored expansion in Western Siberia and the displacement of indigenous populations. So we can expect a 50 minutes or 55 minutes lecture followed by approximately half an hour discussion. So you are welcome to ask questions in German or English. If you choose German, I'm happy to translate. But also Ksenija understands German quite well.
Yeah, work in progress.
Yes. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Julian, for this amazing introduction. I'm already feeling really accomplished after this. So I also would like to thank Thomas Flierl for inviting me and the Max Linder Stiftung for this opportunity to present my research here in Berlin. So today I will talk about my ongoing habilitation project, which I have just started. It is concerned with the role of mobile architecture and rotational urbanism in the gas and oil extraction in Western Siberia during the last decades of the Cold War. With this presentation today, I'd like to highlight some of the archival findings that I've recently encountered, and as we're working through these materials together today, I would also be very grateful for any feedback and suggestions that you might have. So let's start. Next slide, please. In 1976, the official newspaper of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Pravda, published an article on the importance of the so-called rotational settlement model, in Russian Vakhtovy Poselok, to facilitate and augment the national extraction of oil and gas. It was also stated that in the 10th five-year plan, that is roughly between 1976 and 1980, 30 new oil fields in Western Siberia, the country's largest extractive region, were planned to be activated. Next slide. The West Siberian oil basin, which you can see here in the center, was discovered in 1960 with the first industrial extraction commencing in 1968. The untapped oil reserves were scattered across this giant territory, starting from the north of Tumen here, and extending into the south of Kara Sea. This area covered roughly 25 kilometers in length and 1,500 kilometers in width. Much of this projected extractive activity was to take place in the north of Western Siberia, near or inside the circumpolar zone and in the region with permafrost soils. In the context of gradually declining volumes of oil extraction in two other crucial regions, the Soviet Azerbaijan and the Volga region, it also played a crucial role in the country's economy, which reached its peak growth in the mid-60s and since then was experienced relative stagnation. Next one. Over the subsequent decades, the region became the primary source of Soviet oil and gas. Next one. Western Siberia supplied a significant portion of the country's own energy needs and generated substantial export revenue, including in hard currency. This, according to the economic historians of the Soviet Union, allowed the Soviet leadership to postpone the Kosygin economic reform, which aimed at decentralization of governance of industrial enterprises and continue relying on more conservative methods of shock industrialization and crude resource extraction as a leading driver of the national economy. Energy historians of the late Soviet Union point out that the resourcification of Western Siberia was happening extremely fast in comparison with other oil regions such as Azerbaijan or Volga region. And the Soviet press reported intense construction activities in Tyumen Oblast, especially in the Khanty-Mansi and Yamal-Nenets autonomous okrugs. Next. Such fast-paced industrialization, of course, resulted in environmental damage and cases of marginalization or displacement of indigenous communities whose patrimonial lands were first expropriated during the earlier collectivization period and then used for extractive purposes. At the same time, the region, next slide, and saw a rapid internal migration of workers from other parts of the Soviet Union. Next slide. So here you see some references for further study if you're interested in learning more about internal migration from other Soviet republics. I'm not going to tap into this topic more in depth, but it's really fascinating. The workers came from regions with prior expertise in oil and gas, in surveying, in extraction, road building, housing construction, but also workers without prior experience in the industry could be recruited from local villages in the broader Tyumen region. As a result, the demographic structure of Western Siberian cities and settlement could be quite multinational, and this experience is also a common trope in memoirs produced by the so-called pioneers, new settlers, or shift workers. Next slide. For instance, the settlement Leontorsky, which was initially founded in 1979 on a place of a national village, Pim, which before collectivization belonged to Imperov Khanty family, and the settlement acquired city status in 1992. It was located in the northeast of Surgut, and it was shared by Ukrainian shift laborers from Donetsk and Estonian road builders, as well as indigenous Khanty communities. In addition, some modular living units called Unimo system, you can see them here, were delivered from Czechoslovakia. So the settlement exemplified various scales of transregional and international mobility, including people, technology, and knowledge. While there is a growing amount of literature tackling the energy history, labor history, environmental history of Western Siberia, as well as ethnographic work centering on the indigenous communities of the region, what I'm interested in doing today is to understand better the role of architectural and urban planning expertise in this process. So today I'll talk about the architectural history of turning Western Siberia into an extractivist region. Next slide. So in my presentation, I look at how architectural expertise informed or failed to inform planning and design at various scales of such spatial development. In the first part of my talk, I will look at the involvement of professional architects in urban planning in the new territorial settlement structure. The second part will deal with how the idea of rotational settlement came about and the various typologies that emerge with it. And the final part will provide an overview of some of the typologies of mobile built structures designed at the research institutes or industrial enterprises to accommodate various types of labor, including indigenous mobile pastoralists in northern regions. Next slide. So let's start with the first territorial planning scale. Next, please, as well. In 1975, the Leningrad-based Scientific Research and Design Urban Planning Institute, abbreviated as ЛенНИИ градостроительства, submitted a research report to State Committee for Construction. The document contained the recommendations for urban, architectural, and technical tools necessary for further development of the Western Siberian region. The report resulted from the interdisciplinary research conducted by architectural and urban planning professionals in cooperation with representatives of specialized institutes designing for oil industry, the Institute of Geography of Siberia and the Far East, the Regional Department for Construction and Architecture of the Tumen region, and other organizations. The research also used observations from the first oil and gas settlements, many of which were established without the involvement of architectural labor by the shift workers themselves. The study was conducted over the course of 2 years and aimed at working out practical suggestions for the planning structure and settlement systems most effective for the state's extractive goals in the region. Next slide. This report concluded that, quote, a characteristic feature of this region at all stages of mastering and development will be a high degree of mobility and dynamism of the main parameters of the production structure, end quote. The report marked a shift in the state-sponsored development strategy for the north of the USSR, notably the Soviet government policy in constructing northern cities in the first post-war decades centered around concentrated permanent industrial towns such as Norilsk, Vorkuta, and Mirny, and the new proposal put forward this idea of mobility and fluidity of spaces and settlement structures. So let's leaf through this report together to understand the rationale behind this proposal. Next slide. As you will see, this report contains a lot of maps, and which also tells us about the tools the experts use in their communication with the government bodies, and most of the resources that were identified for extraction according to state economic plans, such as oil, on this map represented by black triangles, gas, white triangles, wood, white rectangle, peat, not really sure about this shape, but this is peat, and fish as well, or fish. So most of these resources that were identified for extraction were located in the north of Tumen region. Next slide. At the same time, as development moved further north, it was increasingly more complicated and expensive to construct anything due to various factors. And this map represents the territory and the zoning of the territory based on the expensiveness and complicatedness of construction. So the metrics that they use to arrive at these conclusions were the absence of housing construction plans. Next slide. So we see that the most housing construction plans were located in the Far East, and the Western Siberian region had just simple resources such as wood, brick, sand available, but no complex plans to produce large amounts of prefabricated buildings from prefabricated concrete panels. Another reason why this territory was deemed complicated for development was extremely poor logistical infrastructure. There were very little to no airports. The road network was really badly developed. And next slide. So the Northern Sea Route, the river, Northern Sea Route, going here. The river transport along navigable rivers and railroad transport were the basis of external transport links in the northern oil and gas regions. And at the same time, the Tyumen-Surgut-Nizhnevartovsk railway should have played a significant role in the comprehensive development of the north of Tyumen region, and of course constructing airports in central cities and rotational settlements was also necessary for construction related logistics, because this would allow to bring equipment and prefabricated elements and so on. Next slide. Finally, what was also making this territory challenging for industrial development and urbanization was climatic and weather conditions. Notably, according to the experts, these conditions were challenging to acclimatization of the shift workers' bodies. The region was separated into 4 medical geographical territories. The first 2 zones, the most northern ones, the Yamal and the forest tundra, so these first 2 zones were deemed unsuitable for creating a permanent population from newcomers, and the report claimed, quote, that effective adaptation of the majority of the newcomer population from the central zone of the country is extremely challenging. The main population is concentrated in mobile seasonal settlements. Indigenous residents are busy hunting Arctic foxes, reindeer herding, fishing. Geologists also live in temporary settlements. During urban development, it is necessary to construct an artificial external environment, and the natural environment is volatile to man-made disturbances, end quote. So during industrial development shift, and expeditionary settlements would prevail according to this report. Improvement of the external environments in this region would be 7 to 9 times more expensive than in the more southern zones of the country, due to all these factors: lack of construction base, complicated transportation situation, climatic situation. And it was recommended, the temporary period of residence was recommended for these areas, in addition to population of the territory undergoing a medical examination, and this new population should have comprised of people without chronic pathologies. Only the 3rd zone, in the middle of taiga here, was deemed more or less suitable for permanent residency. Next slide. So apart from medical, geographical, logistic, and natural resources mapping of zones, the report relied on earlier architectural climatic zoning system. So you can see here the map prepared by the Leningrad Zonal Scientific and Design Institute in 1969. According to this classification, the entirety of the Soviet Union was roughly separated into 4 climatic zones, which require different approaches to planning, to building norms, technical regulations, choice of building materials, construction techniques, and consideration of demographic composition and other indicators. And so the region that we're interested in here today fell into the first climatic zone. Next slide. At the beginning of the 60s, the network of the so-called zonal research institutes, research and design institutes, was established within the Gastroy hierarchy and across various Soviet republics. Each institute specialized in designing for different climatic zones. For example, Tashkent and Tbilisi-based zonal institutes, they were designing for regions of the 4th climatic zone, which was identified by extreme periods of extreme heat and higher seismic activity, such as the Caucasus and Central Asia. The institutes that we are interested today were located in Soviet Russia, in Leningrad and Novosibirsk, and they were called Lensdnep and Sibsdnep, and they were focusing on the 1st architectural climatic zone. Next slide. Lensdnep in particular had previous planning experience for the East Siberian northern regions, such as Norilsk and Yakutsk. Their knowledge of how to design in the condition of permafrost soils, snowstorms, and methods of mitigating specific climatic indicators allowed them to receive more and more commissions for research or experimental design in the first climatic zone. These book clippings, for example, analyze different ways to install underground utility infrastructure in the situation of permafrost soil, how to prevent snow drifts, and how to design buildings to consider so-called wind shadows. Therefore, together with the urbanization of Western Siberia, the definition of the northern extreme environment and mitigating architectural techniques were developed. Next slide. Finally, the most important factor cited in the reports was the specificities of gas, oil, and timber extraction, and the dispersed placements of these natural resource deposits. Next slide. So the extraction sites and servicing stations in these industries could be separated by hundreds of kilometers. In addition, some extractive sites were depleted just within several decades. Soviet economists and planners estimated the development period for an oil field as approximately 20 to 35 years, and for gas field between 15 and 20 years. Next slide. So for your reference, here is the contemporary wood logging rotational settlement in Khanty-Mansi Autonomous Okrug, as seen from Google Earth. Next slide. And this is the same rotational settlement and how it looks on a larger scale, demonstrating various smaller temporarily logging stations. So the urban planners proposed a rotational settlement system to address this type of labor mobility and temporality of resource depletion. Next slide. Therefore, the shift labor method meant that the temporary physical separation of workers from places of dwelling and consumption of social and cultural services from places of labor application. The workers would be delivered to work in shifts, which could last for several weeks, depending on the situation and their tasks. Next slide. With the Siberian branch of the Academy of Sciences of the USSR, Leonid Gradostроительство, so the urban planning consultant of the Gosstroy, developed a three-tier approach to the territorial and regional planning in Western Siberia. The first tier would comprise of the oldest so-called anchor Siberian cities. Can we return to the previous slide? Yeah. This would be Tyumen and Tobolsk. The second tier, the so-called base cities, where all the necessary social infrastructure and permanent houses for shift workers would be located. What was the second tier? This would be the Nizhnevartovsk and Surgut. And according to this scheme, the third tier would be these fly-in, fly-out settlements, Vakhtove Poselki, near oil and gas fields, which would have only basic infrastructure and where workers would fly or travel by bus in weekly shifts. In some cases, the expedition method would be used in the absence of regular connection between the base city and the oil or gas field, and this would mean that workers would leave the base city for up to several months. So in this case, the shift settlement would need to be equipped much better. Next slide. So let's jump to the scale of urbanism and see how architects and planners imagined these rotational settlements. Next slide. The rotational method was not an invention of 60s, 70s, and 80s. It was used earlier as well for the development of resources in difficult or extreme conditions. One of the most well-known examples of Stalin-era rotational settlement was the oil field called Oil Rocks in the Caspian Sea. It was built in 1949 within 110 kilometers from Baku and I think about 40 kilometers from the shore. On average, in the 70s, this rotational settlement housed 2,500 people. Residential dormitory buildings and most service buildings on this platform were erected from prefabricated wooden panel houses. And laborers in this settlement would live up to 6 to 12 people in a room, which was 2 to 4 times lower than the all-union housing standards. which would allocate them 1.5 to 3 square meter per person. Next slide. So drawing on the experience of building and maintenance of the oil rocks and other early rotational settlements, as well as contemporary reports from a Soviet architect that went on a study trip to Alaska to observe the extractive activity and organization there. So Ленни Градостроительство summarized all these data and articulated the main principles of a rotational settlement planning approach. All settlement planning solution, according to their report, should have maintained the principle of an open system, which would allow for the addition of more elements at any time. The settlements should have been reversible, for instance, allowing the settlement to close and move after the resource is depleted. The communications and energy supply should have been very rigid and effective. Next slide. 4 planning structures for rotational settlement were proposed in the report. You can see them here in the lower right corner. The first junction planning typology was designed for the smallest settlements, for instance, the settlement of geologists between 10 and 100 people, and with the length of existence between 5 months and 1 year. It could be arranged around the communications center, so the living units would just be attached to one communications node. The second linear typology was defined by the connections of living cells to communication nodes, and it would be possible to arrange it in a linear or a close contour manner, and it was planned to accommodate roughly up to 3,000 people. Finally, a flat network structure, the third one, was defined by the intersection of communication in one plane, and so it would have several communications, which would allow to expand the settlement and add more elements on it. And it was designed for up to 10,000 inhabitants. Next slide. The rotational settlements should have always been planned in connection with social and transportation infrastructure of the closest base city. As historian Ekaterina Kalemeneva demonstrated, unlike previous waves of shock industrialization and migration under Stalin that often used forced labor for large infrastructural projects such as the White Sea Canal in eastern Karelia or industrial cities such as Magnitogorsk or Norilsk, the Brezhnev government and the government of the Tyumen region had to create new conditions for attracting large numbers of skilled workers to voluntarily relocate themselves or their families to live and work in the harsh weather and living conditions. Next slide. Along with the higher wages, planning and housing provisions were seen as another incentive that would have helped combat high worker turnovers. Therefore, the planners argued that social and cultural services, along with housing and recreation, were crucial for retaining newly arrived workers. However, such a balanced development was never achieved, and many families waited for years to receive their housing in a base city. Next slide. Other tools to motivate people to relocate to the region were these techno-utopian imaginaries and kind of propaganda. The journal Техника молодежи, for example, helped me reconstruct some of these futuristic projections addressed to young Soviet technical intelligentsia, among them potential new settlers. The journal depicted futuristic cities stretching out to the northern forests and rivers. Next slide. Other articles had popularized the idea of a monoblock inspired by contemporaneous Japanese metabolist architect Kenzo Tange. Instead of a rotational camp with separate buildings that are constantly covered in snow and poorly heated, the architects proposed designing large, close contour villages protected from weather, next slide, and filled with attractive social services such as gardens, libraries, and cultural centers. Next slide. Another publication, the professional architectural journal Architekturen SSR, cited the idea of a climate control environment. The architects proposed to arrange a rotational settlement from a series of courtyards with gardens and enclosed passages. Next slide. While most of these proposals were unrealized, the last project was actually implemented in one place in the world. It is called the Pionierny rotational settlement in the northern Tomsk Oblast. The rotational settlement of Pionierny, it was located on the new oil field in the Vasyugan swamps, and it was to accommodate 3,000 oil workers, which would arrive by airplane from the nearby Strizhevoy oil town. The designer of Pionierny was the former chief architect of Tomsk, Viktor Novikov, and the design and construction for this settlement occurred between 1976 and 1987. And a distinctive feature of the project was that everything in the complex was covered under one roof. At the community center, dormitory center, library, several cafeterias were planned, and each block was envisioned to accommodate up to 375 workers. Next slide. Even though only 3 blocks were eventually built and only one of them received a winter garden, the complex was broadcasted on central television as an exemplary project for oil workers' accommodation. Next slide. Another scale of design intervention into the Soviet extractive regime in Western Siberia was a design of mobile dwelling units, accommodating various types of industrial labor. Next slide. Similar to rotational settlements, the idea to design a portable and easily erectable built structure was not new to Soviet economy. For instance, next slide, please. For instance, I found this publication from 1944 suggesting the option of standardization of the dugouts for logging settlements. So the dugout is the building that would be basically created from a pit in the earth, and the roof would be added afterwards. So this was a proposal to accommodate laborers working in the logging wood industry in the 40s. Next slide. Another example was a manual for construction of portable wooden buildings for miners, which was published in 1958 in Kharkiv in Soviet Ukraine. Next slide. However, for architects working in Lenzniev Institute, it was important to separate their work ideologically from the previous examples of temporary buildings. They claimed that temporary structures do not provide a sufficient level of comfort and sanitary and hygienic requirements, which does not help worker retention in strategically important regions such as Western Siberia. In addition, half of the temporary buildings cannot be reused after the goal of the rotational settlement is expired, as they were not designed to be disassembled and transported to another place. Instead, mobile buildings, argued architects, should have been produced using industrial methods in a more cost-effective manner. Next slide. So the architects of Lenzniev argued that mobility in such structures would be created through 2 main modes, the modular or container-based or collapsible or prepackaged prefab element structures. The modular structures were container-type buildings that were produced whole at the factory. For higher mobility, there would be mobile homes attached to wheels, which would be more expensive, and the container ones that were cheaper, but the downside was that you would need a crane to load and unload the unit from the transportation vehicle. Prefabricated houses from individual or packaged elements for repeated installation and dismantling were also quite inexpensive, but required a lot of labor during the installation stage. And so the latter type was recommended for the settlements where the stay was more extended, up to 10 years. And the third type, the third mode of mobility was also discussed in the earlier experiments, and preparatory research, but it was not ultimately widely used in the region. However, I also decided to include it in the presentation just to look at the full spectrum of visions of mobility. Next slide. One of the most widely used types of modular units was known as ZUB, which referred to cylindrical unified blocks that served as dormitories for 4 people. And ZUB was one of the several industrially produced container-type mobile building that accommodated workers in rotational settlements. And here you can see ZUBs arranged together in the Bovanenka gas field in Yamal. The ZUB was heated with a stove and could be connected to electric grid, and they were produced at the Volokholamsk mechanical repair plant. They were relatively light, cheap to make, and easy to deliver to the site. They were delivered almost completely assembled, and which solved the problem of the lack of construction base and shortage of skilled construction workers. Next slide. Architects also proposed to arrange these ZUBs from small settlements into a larger complex of closed contour settlements to better protect the workers from external environmental conditions such as mosquitoes and snow and wind, but so far I have never seen ZUBs to be arranged in such a way. Next slide. The idea of interlocking modules related to the first mobility principle, the expandability principle, the structure could adapt to population growth or the population decline by adding or subtracting the modules. Next slide. For instance, the school or a boarding school project could change based on the growing or declining number of children in rural areas of Western Siberia. On the one hand, the closed contour modules arrangement went hand in hand with the principles of the Northern construction and enhanced shielding from the environmental impact. Next slide. The topic of new building materials was an essential theme for experiments in Lenzniep Institute because buildings should be transported for quite long distances. The architects searched for lighter solutions and experimented with building materials such as plastic or aluminium. Between 1961 and 1962, Lenzniep had already conducted experiments with plastic and related materials in their experimental project for a plastic house, which you see on the slide. And the prototype for this plastic house was erected in Leningrad and tested for several months, but the results were unsatisfactory and it was not launched into mass construction. Next slide. The plastic experiments in building construction generally stopped around 1930 or in 1973 with the oil crisis. So many of these projects, they didn't reach mass production as they were not performing so well hygienically and were no longer economically practical. But this proposal of the housing unit from plastic also by Lenzniep, it was basically drew on their earlier experiment with the plastic house in Leningrad and was also based on this idea of modularity, expandability, and the composition of prefabricated elements. Next slide. Another topic of experiment was energy supply, because expeditions and initial surveying work was not often performed close to power lines, often performed remotely. The architects from the Moscow Architectural Institute collaborated with the Research and Production Association Quantum, which produced autonomous energy projects for military and civil purposes. So together with this company, they produced a solar panel covered container settlement, which was also unrealized, but it's useful to reflect upon the problems that architects try to tackle here. Next slide. This model was made by the light building department of the Lenzniep. The architect here proposed assembling a sectional residential building, a kindergarten, and a school using light aluminum panels. Next slide. And actually, this model was not based on a container principle, but it required a steel frame to which the aluminum panels would later be added. Actually, this project was implemented in the Arctic port settlement of Amaterma, and with this program, they erected the permafrost laboratory in this port city. As most of the Western Siberian region, as we've learned from the first part of the presentation, was classified as a part of the first climatic zone, defined by extremely low temperatures, heavy snowfall, gushing winds, swampy or permafrost soils, the architectural expertise also relied upon this research on permafrost and the behavior of permafrost to tackle the challenges of construction in the zones. So the permafrost laboratory allowed the climatic sciences to collect data on the behavior of the soils, but also helped architects eventually to find ways to build in these conditions more effectively. Next slide. Throughout the 1980s, the design and production of mobile structures soon developed as an industry in the Soviet Union. I still need to do a lot of attribution work to identify the most popular types of mobile living units. And here you can see the examples of industrially produced mobile buildings, which were presented in the exhibition for mobile buildings, which took place in Moscow in 1986. And actually, this exhibition reveals that the industrial efficiency rather overshadowed the earlier visionary proposals of the architectural establishment in Leningrad. And these mobile living units are much less kind of architecturally expressive and more influenced by industrial production methods. And in fact, they were produced by industrial enterprises. Next slide. While some architects clearly treated the workers as subjects of need and aimed to provide them with comfort in the so-called extreme environment, the actual rotational settlements and housing in the so-called base towns, such as Surgut, treated the laborers as subjects of labor power. As the analysis of thematic Soviet press selection from OSHA archives in Budapest, it's the archives of Radio Free Europe, which produced the surveys of Soviet press. This revealed that kind of these mobile buildings proposals and housing construction and base cities proposals were often far from the lived reality. Multiple newspapers, articles, and reports preserved in the archive pointed to acute housing shortages for oil and gas industry workers who were, while waiting for the allocation of an accommodation in their base city, often resorted to living in self-built barracks, decommissioned wagons, dugouts, which architects ventured to eliminate in the first place. Next slide. Prefabricated buildings made of lightweight materials was another common type of mobile buildings in Western Siberia. For instance, the Krasnoyarsk Promstroy project, developed and launched into production what was called the block package. Next slide. The design of the block package was specifically driven by the strategic goals of the oil and gas industry in the region. They were lightweight, they were cheap, they were easy to assemble by non-specialists, they were adapted to the first climatic zone, and they were easy transport to another extractive site as necessary. Next slide. Yeah, they could be even transported by a helicopter. Promstroy project block package was utilized, for instance, in the zone where without roads, so the helicopter would deliver these units in the absence of existing logistic communications. Next slide. Another finding was the article on the wooden prefabricated houses, which allowed me to attribute one of the largest suppliers of wooden panel houses in Western Siberia and the Baikal-Amur mainline. It was a Salginsky house building plant located in Arkhangel region. It produced several hundred prefabricated and packaged houses per year, I think around 350. And the houses were then shipped to various large construction sites. Next slide. Another type of mobile building, yet less popular, but also to me more exciting, were pneumatic structures. They were promoted by the Moscow-based architect and sculptor Vyacheslav Kolychuk, who was developing highly engineered self-expanding structures. They would arrive flat, but could be lifted by a crane in several hours. I think it's the next slide. Yeah, so this is the Kolychuk's project. It was not specifically designed to Western Siberia, but I saw some archived reports of Lenzniev which did discuss the possibility of use of pneumatic and inflatable buildings in the region, which didn't really take place, but I think this is interesting to just retrace this intellectual trajectory. So let's move to the final part. Next slide. So this image from Technika Молодежи journal paints an idyllic picture of coexistence of highly industrialized and engineered structures and local indigenous minorities who were still involved in traditional activities such as reindeer herding. Yet, despite such imagery, the extractive activities and paternalistic state policies had a catastrophic effect on indigenous cultures in the region, and these communities that wanted to continue to live off their land experienced continued marginalization. Next slide. The Soviet Union officially recognized 26 so-called small nations of the North, and unlike other indigenous peoples in the Soviet Union, such as Armenians, Georgians, or Ukrainians, they had no territorial autonomy and little to no government representations. Most of them didn't even make it to this US-made map based on the Soviet census data from 1979 because they didn't include the populations which were under 12,000 people. Next slide. With the arrival of glasnost in the late 80s, the Soviet press began to openly discuss the challenges faced by indigenous communities such as Khanty, Nenets, Mansi, Naganasan, and others. Next. Next one. Yeah, there would be a lot of papers here. So they touched upon deeply unjust problems faced by these groups, the ecological problems caused by extractivism, cultural erasure, unequal social markers such as meager life expectancy rates and high suicide rates, the problem of the so-called shattered families resulting from compulsory education of children of reindeer herders in boarding schools, the reluctance of authorities to recognize and provide adequate compensation for repressions and state violence that indigenous communities experienced during forced collectivization. Next one. And next one. Yeah. So recently, or better say in the last 30 years, anthropologists have developed various frameworks to describe these dynamics between the state, the settlers, and the indigenous people, and the kind of indigenous people behind such settlements. And some scholars made a case that this industrial encroachment could be classified as a type of Soviet industrial or settler colonialism. Next slide. A small number of mobile pastoralists who were allowed to continue to migrate were incorporated into the Soviet agricultural economy as professional reindeer herders. And so this map also demonstrates the patterns of mobility that these mobile reindeer herders were kind of allowed to maintain. So they could migrate from the settled settlements to a temporary one, where they would be accommodated for a seasonal, the house for seasonal migration, or for instance, they could bring a portable dwelling with them. So once a lifestyle or a cultural practice informed by indigenous knowledges, their activity in this framework was redefined as a type of waged labor, as they were arranged in mobile herding brigades or settled in agricultural collectives. Next slide. So during my research at the archive, I found several also largely unrealized projects of mobile building units designed for these herders. According to the Ministry of Agriculture of Soviet Russia, 15 light mobile homes were needed to house agricultural workers of the far north. And so these projects, both proposals, they proposed to modernize the portable yurt, the yurt on sleds, and these were two proposals, one from aluminium and plastic, and another one from fully from plastic on a wooden frame and wooden sleds. Next slide. So architects employed various strategies. For instance, in this project, they attempted to replace the traditional building materials with modern ones, such as Nganasan sled tent could be covered with animal skins, and here they developed plastic panels, as well as fiberglass sheeting for the internal lining. And also for internal lining, they use the material called the low-density polyethylene, which I guess is also another type of plastic. And the sleds for the yurt would be used from bent wood. They also produced a prototype in Leningrad for this yurt, but the prototype showed a kind of not really satisfactory performance of the manufactured heating and ventilation device. It was simply too hot in this yurt. So again, this project wasn't launched in mass production. Next slide. It was believed that modern building materials will improve the insulation and heat retention in the portable houses, but it was not always the case. So this slide demonstrates the Khanty seasonal houses and storage places that would be used at the settlements or during seasonal migration. And next slide. The architects proposed to modernize these houses in a more modern-looking way from industrially produced timber. Next slide. The third strategy of designing for indigenous communities was vernacularization of otherwise modernist building typologies, such as communal housing. Next slide. And finally, the introduction of completely new elements to herders' material reality, such as this lens house, which also saw just one prototype and didn't reach mass production. But it was suggested to provide this house both to the builders of new rotational settlements, the prospectors, or reindeer herders. Next slide. Yeah, this is another image of the lens house. It could be also arranged into a small settlement, and it was designed from this material called armor cement. So this is a specific lighter type of cement, which I never met before, but we need to research a little more about the application of this material in this design. So next slide. It is often difficult to adequately reconstruct the perspectives of indigenous communities around the social, political, architectural logics related to facilitating oil extraction in the Soviet context. And the documentary films were really helpful as they allowed me to further reflect on how settlers and indigenous communities experience the resourcification of Western Siberia differently. While the new settlers of oil and gas industry experience a gradual modernization of their living conditions, the new mobile living units, growth of mobility, indigenous communities instead often face displacement. In the Soviet context, their ancestral lands were not legally protected from oil and gas extraction, and families were often gradually evicted from their land if a promising field had been discovered or were given inadequate compensation. Next slide. The documentary and ethnographic films also allowed me to understand better various resistance strategies that some indigenous activists mobilized immediately after the collapse of the Soviet Union. For instance, Khanty writer and activist and politician Yeremei Aipin chose not to directly oppose oil extraction, which would otherwise put him in direct opposition to the state, and he could not implement systemic changes. He therefore criticized not the oil extraction itself, but unfair redistribution and compensation of indigenous communities who were forced to leave their lands to allow for extraction. Even with this lighter agenda, he was not allowed to run for election to the State Duma in December 1995 election. In contrast, the Forest Nenets writer and activist Yuri Vella fearlessly entered an open opposition with the Lukoil company, demonstrating the commitment to the cause by slashing the tires of one of the machines belonging to the company, and it was a huge trial against Vella. But the oil pollution and issues of land were kind of central subjects of his activism and his poetry as well. So I would like to end this presentation, next slide, with one of Vella's poems, which is called A Temporary City. The poem was written on the Lukoil city of Kogalim, which during the late Soviet period was initially constructed to service a train station during the Soviet period. On the land of the deer breeding hunter tribes of Sapochin and Yermakov families. And the poem reads, "The glitter of oil rubles is splendid. The tents are clenched in the distance. The hunter man laughs in the green of a tambourine. The nenet smirks into his eyelashes. On a dead place, a dead city, a dead future boasts. Temporary people in a temporary bar, temporary beer, sip greedily. Temporary century over their shoulders. Temporary minutes in a clock ticking away." But in the morning, the sky woke up with the cries of the departing geese, and the thin ice on the edge of the lake glistened. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this, I think, very dense and very intense and also a bit moving lecture, which for me is like opens up a completely new world, because I personally don't know much about this topic, and it looks like you have done very much archival research on this. Which I'm grateful, and I will start with one question, because we talked about this before. As you said, these temporary and mobile structures. I mean, there's a long history of mobile architecture in the 20th century, I would say. And is there are there any international connections, international connections between the architects and the planners like also this research on how to build on permafrost, how to build in cold regions. Did they like had an exchange with architects from other cold regions, like Alaska or something, and also, I mean, this mobile architecture, these plastic houses, I think we know all these 60s plastic house boom we had, and not just in Western Germany, but like in a lot of cities, countries. Did they like, how was this, was there any flow of knowledge, exchange, transfer, also like companies from other countries who were involved in these construction activities?
Yeah, thanks for these questions. There were several ways this international exchange could happen. First type of exchange that existed were official study trips. For instance, one of the Lensniep employees, he did a study trip to Alaska to specifically compare the conditions of kind of extractive industries and how they accommodated them in the US, and what could be learned for Western Siberia. And for instance, already there they observed this block kind of principle. They also analyzed through the scientific kind of information libraries the literature on Canada, on Norway, and on Finland. So they had a broad survey. They had several research department within this Leningrad Lensniep Zonal Institute. So they were well aware of the trends in the Western countries. There were also exhibits in the Soviet Union, which might have influenced the kind of aesthetics, especially of these plastic houses. For instance, some architectural historians, they pointed out that the American exhibition in Moscow in 1959 might have influenced the aesthetics of the Leningrad 1961 plastic house. I personally haven't found a direct connection, but clearly it's quite similar to Eames aesthetics and experiments and so on. And actually, a friend of mine, another architectural historian, Kollei Kerafeev, he several months ago, he sent me some archival documents he found that documented the agreements between the Soviet Union, Czechoslovakia, and the Soviet Union and GDR for the construction of modular factories in Western Siberia for producing the units. So this is so far the only document I've seen that documents this agreement. I don't know if they were implemented. This is something to work in the future. And also another point of this kind of knowledge transfer was the construction of the Druzhba pipeline, and the part of the pipeline that went through Soviet Ukraine was constructed by the GDR teams, and they brought the different mobile building types that were used in the GDR to the Soviet Ukraine, including this Raum, again I forgot the Raum Weiterungshalle. So this famous typology, which was really popular in East Germany, the house that could kind of open up. And so I saw archival photos that were made by East German photographer of the process of laying the pipeline, and kind of the different housing types are visible there. I can share these photos as well. So there were study trips, exhibitions, direct contacts, and
Because when I think of plastic houses, I would not think of like it's possible to build them actually in a cold zone.
Yeah,
and I mean there must have been some experience made before. They didn't have to do it again, maybe. But
yeah, I don't. Oh, sorry.
What's this?
I don't know any kind of plastic houses that really went through the testing stage and they were really erected, but one of the houses that I've shown one of the Lensnier plastic houses, they had a conversation, the archived conversation with the Norilsk plant, and they wanted this plant to produce this one of the plastic houses in the series, but this conversation didn't arrive anywhere, and the motivation to use plastic was mainly the lightness, because they really needed to solve the problem of lightness. For instance, I had one interview with residents who lived in the rotation of the settlement called Pakachi, which was constructed by a Belarusian construction trust. And they said that the panels, so the settlement was constructed from prefabricated concrete panels, and apparently they were brought from Belarus. They were brought by train, the panels for houses, by train to Surgut, and from Surgut they would bring these panels in trucks to Pakachi and build prefab panel houses there, because there was no panel factory at the time to supply this. So that is why, again, this would be super expensive. So it would be 5 to 7 times more expensive to build in this region, because there was,
interesting. Another question regarding this indigenous architecture, because I was thinking, why did they in the first place try to industrialize like this already traditional, like approved mobile architecture? Was it like this hegemonic approach to control and to industrialize like the construction process to make it faster, or what was the reason actually? I don't know if it's I think it's a very broad question, but you can answer this.
I think there were the ideological implications, because in the special issue of Architekturen SR, which discusses this project, sometimes the indigenous dwellings are kind of described as not delivering the hygienic standard, not delivering the proper insulation standard, and so on. So they were described in this kind of rhetoric. On the other hand, there were theorists in the Soviet Union, such as the chief architect of the author called Jangar Purveev, the Kalmyk architectural theorist. And he basically wrote a book which was called From Nomadic to Mobile Architecture, and he was praising the qualities of the prefabricated buildings, or the collapsible buildings, portable buildings, but he was praising the qualities of lightness, of portability, which were basically aspirational for architects. But he was again saying that, the traditional materials should be replaced to the modern ones, because this is the proper kind of identity of the herder, which is kind of included into the Soviet system of collectivized reindeer herding. So I think there was a kind of racialized and ideological kind of narratives around so-called modernization of indigenous housing. And what is also interesting is that Lensnieb, they did these proposals not only for nomadic herders in Western Siberia, but also in rural Mongolia. So they cooperated with the Mongolian Institute on the modernization of Ger, which is a Mongolian portable house. And in this case, they also proposed to replace more traditional building materials such as felt with this artificial kind of textile that I showed on one of the slides. So they wanted to use the experience of designing for herders in Western Siberia and translate it to Mongolia, but this also, I haven't found that this went further than the prototype. For the Mongolia, they designed 4 proposals of modernizing the yurt or ger, and only one went to prototype, and then no trace of it being used, being mass produced.
Okay. Yeah, because of course we know this trait, no? Like, but from earlier decades and not from the 80s maybe, there's like a contradictory tendency to go back to the traditional forms in the 80s, which I'm experienced. But yeah, because this is also because it's so relatively late not discovered or somehow, yeah, we should erschließen. Sometimes also lacking words. But I want to open up the discussion. If you want to have any, if you have any questions, just yeah, please.
Yeah, many thanks for a very interesting presentation. I have a question that connects to the point you've just been discussing. I was wondering if the Soviet architects only tried to copy or to improve or to appropriate the building techniques by the indigenous communities, to re-export them or to re-implement them for the indigenous communities, or did they also try to appropriate these techniques for the settlers? That was something that I was wondering.
Mm. There was the book again that I've referenced from nomadic to mobile architecture, which was co-written by Soviet architect Jangar Perveyev and the Mongolian member of Mongolian government Maidar. And actually Perveyev was an advisor to Maidar during the kind of also establishment of herding brigades in the rural Mongolia. And this book actually argued that the experience of kind of the shared experience of Soviet nomadic communities and Mongolian nomadic communities could be utilized for the future imaginaries of the Soviet socialist mobile urbanism. For instance, they said that these typologies could be used to accommodate recreation. And in fact, there were, in Mongolia, there were tourist complexes where tourists could live in a yurt. So it was basically implemented, not on a large scale, but kind of this reverse tendency was also discussed. They also said that the experience of collapsible structures such as GER, which was really efficient. It had a wooden frame and several layers of felt and could be collapsed and transported within several hours, so that this experience could be indeed really useful for mobile urbanism. But what was interesting is that when they discussed these future projections of socialist mobile urbanism, they were expecting for nomadic herders to become less and less mobile, and for other industries such as tourism or extractivism to become more and more mobile. So it was this kind of paradox. On the one hand, they were praising certain elements of these typologies, traditional typologies, but on the other hand, they were saying, okay, they are already in the past, because we will replace them with the other things. So the tendency that could be observed is this compartmentalization of kind of the typology. It was no longer perceived as a whole, but it was perceived as a kind of a number of parts, and they could pick and choose which one to keep and which ones to modernize without really a consultation with the people who would use them in the end. But yeah, returning to your question, there was this Jangar Perveyev who worked a lot on theorizing the learning from the nomads in the 80s, and so this was a prominent book. It also had kind of the ethno-nationalist elements, kind of this rediscovery of the shared nomadic past and nomadic heritage, because the introduction to the book was written by Gumilev, who was this really weird theorist who proposed this concept of ethnies, which was like a pseudo-scientific theory, and later this theory inspired Dugin, who is basically a founder of a Russian fascist ideology. So it also had kind of really really complex implications with the rise of nationalism, this kind of re-engagement with the kind of imagined shared nomadic past and so on. So.
To this regarding this topic, or because I had to just completely different, but you want to? No.
It's not related to this topic. You have a different topic.
I had a very different topic,
Okay.
and maybe you had one who's connected.
No, I just was wondering, what is the difference between the rotational settlements and the mobile architecture? Like one, because rotational settlement is kind of like a fixed settlement where labor is rotated, and the mobile architecture is moving to, it's temporary, it's going to a particular place to be able to move elsewhere. So when is one used and when is the other used?
I had it's the same question, so it's fitting.
So rotational settlement is used when the type of labor is described. So this is the type of labor where you go for several weeks to a settlement, for instance, close to oil or gas kind of element of an industry or a mine extractive site. And then you return back to your city and you have, for instance, 3-week holiday. And then you go back and you have like 12-hour shifts and so on. And so the rotational settlement would be the final destination of your labor. If you're an oil person, if you're, for instance, monitoring the certain elements of the gas pipeline and so on. And mobile architecture is just the kind of the movable building units that might or might not be used in rotational settlements. They might be used, for instance, for geologists. For instance, geologists go to one place, they establish a camp of mobile living units, they do their surveying, then they pack up, they go to another place, or for instance, surveyors and so on. Mobile buildings would be most often used in the beginning of the establishment of rotational settlement. For instance, the first construction trust arrives, there is nothing. They need to construct a part of the railway to connect the city, or the road, or the airport, because there is nothing that connects the city to the nearest base settlement. So they would put, for instance, tents, or they put barracks, or they put portable wagons, that whatever they have available. And then, for instance, they could gradually establish a more permanent houses, like, for instance, bring in concrete prefabricated panels and grow the settlements. So some settlements eventually would grow into cities, such as Kogalimsky grew into Kogalim, Lyantorsky grew into Lyantor, but some settlements were abandoned. So, for instance, there are former rotational settlements that existed for several years, and now the last census, the population is 0. So they never grew into larger cities. And there are some settlements where the population is declining, for instance. So there would be different scenarios for these rotational settlements to develop. I don't know, is this clear, the difference? So, and what I've tried to show is that when they speak about rotational settlements, they speak rather about the urban scale, the labor mobility, and when they use the term mobile architecture, it's rather kind of the immediate living arrangement that could be from wood, a barrack type, that could be from the metal, the tube, and so on. So, yeah.
So did they really also move then, or were they just set up one time and then Did they really like were used like 2 or 3, 10 times or not?
So for sure the geologists move a lot. I need to do more interviews with people working in rotational settlements. I actually did one interview with the person who worked on Samatlor extractive site, and he said that he started working there in a rotational settlement in 1987, and they were given these prefab units. And he said he's working there since, so it never moved. It was just established, and they still use the Soviet units, and they were once refurbished. So there is a Soviet units from the Soviet period used for more than 20 years already with the Euroremont, the kind of refurbishment inside. And I had also a family story with this unit, because my grandmother, she was working as a librarian for the Gas Institute in Novosibirsk, so the institute which also provided the stuff for surveying. And eventually my grandmother was given a country house, so the land to build her country house. And from her job, she was able to acquire for free the decommissioned wagon, which still is stands there on their country house. And this decommissioned wagon, according to her, came from the surveyors that no longer needed it. And so she was able to get it for free through her institute and install it in her country house. So sometimes the reuse was really unexpected. It was not reused within necessarily the extractive industry, but within the private recreation via illicit arrangements between the employee and the organization. And so this wagon, it was from wood, but it was covered with aluminium sheets. The entry was from the center, and it would have 2 bedrooms, and so 1 kitchen and a dining area. And so they would install this wagon in their country house, and they used it while they were constructing their dacha, basically.
Interesting.
So, but yeah, I would need to learn more about how actually this concept of reusing mobile architecture, how often was it happening, or
I mean, if it was on wheels, but then it also cannot go so fast, as far again.
They can go quite far. If they attach to the vehicles, I think they're called like all-terrain vehicles, like kind of special vehicles. But yeah, the houses on wheels, I saw photographs. They still are using some of these typologies, so these would definitely be reused. I'm more wondering about the prefab wooden houses. Like, I have doubts that these would be reused, but still the intention was there. I would still need to do more research to understand. For instance, this Estonian construction trust in Landor, when they completed their work, did they take the units with them, or did they leave some, and how many did they leave, and so on. But I haven't yet gone to the archives in Tallinn, and so I will learn hopefully about these later.
Yeah, thanks for a wonderful presentation. Just to follow up, I guess I have a twofold question. Just about what you were just discussing. So it almost seems there were different like temporary horizons inscribed into the mobile, the rotational, and also these techno-utopian city houses. So all and in reality actually becoming more permanent or striving towards some kind of more like permanence there. And this was connected to the question I had throughout, as we talked so much about these prototypes and the mobile architecture and these imaginaries in a sense. I was wondering to what extent the Soviet architects or the planners who came up with these different designs and prototypes there almost seemed to be a huge discrepancy and mismatch between what was then actually built and happening on the ground and what they imagined these workers would need or aspire to.
Yeah, thanks for this. There was indeed a huge mismatch, especially between the Leningrad Institute and I saw one archived kind of typed discussion. So there was a meeting in the 60s between different organizations and institutes involved in construction for the North. And so Lenzniev were presenting their projects. So they were discussing the new typology for prefabricated panel buildings. And the Lenzniev was presenting one, and the institute from Yakutsk was saying this is not simply gonna work in this climatic conditions. So they were often these back and forth between the institutes. So Yakutsk is more eastern Siberia, it's not exactly western Siberia, but in the files of Sibzniep, I also saw a lot of examples of how, for instance, prefabricated buildings that were initially designed for more milder climates were delivered to Novosibirsk, and then they were completely not suitable. For instance, they were highlighting that the lower floors of the building, they shouldn't be inhabited if the building is constructed on the permafrost soil, because the heat from the lift spaces would make permafrost to melt, which would lead to instability. So basically they developed this shift foundation. So each building on the permafrost soil was since built on a shift, kind of the foundation to allow for circulation of air, and so the soil doesn't melt and the building doesn't collapse. Then another difference that was introduced to prefab panel buildings in this zone was the bigger areas in the entry area, because the people in this region, they would wear a lot of clothes, so they would need, for instance, the drying rooms. And otherwise, if they would construct a building from a norm according to normal norms that are not adjusted to this region, they would have like huge puddles of melted snow in the entry area. So these were all the mistakes they were making, and then they were introducing new series that would account for that. Another big mismatch in the beginning was demographic factor, because a lot of the housing series that were designed for central areas of the Soviet Russia, they were designed for kind of with a certain demographics in mind. And the Western Siberia, the percentage of single people or small families was much higher. So they needed more houses that would accommodate the kind of these different family structures. They would need to account for that as well, because everything was so centralized, and it's a long process that they need to update kind of what series the plant is producing. So it would sometimes take years to correct these mismatches and update the series. And for instance, the Sibzniep Institute, they eventually designed the series 97, I think, and 100 something, but I can check the number that were specifically for this zone, and this would include all the mistakes that were done with the other housing. Yeah, but clearly there was a lot of kind of imagery, especially in the earlier designs, and kind of complete lack of understanding of concrete conditions. And that's why after analyzing the kind of the architectural archives, I understand that I need to look more in the direction of construction trusts, which I think in the end had more impact on the urbanization in the region rather than the architects. So so this is what I'm planning to do in Tallinn and Vilnius, to go to the archives of construction trusts and housing plants that provided construction labor for Kogalim and Lantor, also like two oil cities in Western Siberia, and to look at these processes more from a construction workers' perspective and builders' perspective, rather than from architects' perspective, which was clearly very kind of idealistic, but still interesting to see.
And were there any technical innovations or like experiments which proved to be somehow successful? You say like.
I mean, the pile foundation was a big thing. I mean, it's not like a huge innovation, but it was widespread in these areas, which allowed to kind of urbanize permafrost areas. Another solution that was actually already used in Norilsk, and the design of Norilsk was a closed contour districts, which would allow to protect the microrayons from winds and snowstorms and so on. So it was small urban planning solutions or small kind of technical innovations such as pile foundations that would actually make the construction of these buildings possible. I don't know about something really groundbreaking, but to me, I find the proposals of Kolychuk, Vyacheslav Kolychuk, the pneumatic system, quite interesting, but he was, I think, more artistic in this project of self-built pneumatic house. But yeah, I'd like to research that case a little more as well. Because we know Vyacheslav Kolychuk more as an artist, as a sculptor, but we don't know him as kind of practicing specialist. So that would be another interesting direction, but nothing really groundbreaking, honestly.
Yeah. I saw one sign of you. No, no, not actually. You?
Sorry. I was wondering if you know anything about the kind of everyday life in the rotational settlements. What was life like? I don't know if this is a good question, but and I was also wondering about the relationship at the time of the rotational settlements with the indigenous community. We know that they were displaced, or you said they were displaced. I don't know, were they working in the oil fields as well? What were the community kind of engagement?
They were different scenarios, so it really depends on the settlement. The everyday life in a rotational settlement, I've collected for future analysis some memoirs, so there is a huge kind of practice of remembering and writing about this practice. It's really romanticized among the people who used to work in this region, so I have a folder on my computer with all these memoirs, which I haven't yet opened, so I hopefully later I will tell you about everyday life in the rotational settlement. And so about the interactions with indigenous communities, where they were employed in oil industry, for instance, in Lantor, what was happening, there was a Khanty village which burned in the 1980s. Nobody knows why, but it was burned, and then it was replaced with one of the microrayons of Lantor. But at the same time, Estonian road builders, they founded a museum of Khanty architecture. So when they were constructing roads, and there would be a Khanty labaz, which is this kind of a storage on the legs, they would transport it to a specific place, which later became a museum of traditional Khanty wooden architecture. But which was quite paradoxical, because the real village was eventually destroyed and replaced with microrayon, but then the museum, the ethnographic museum, remained, and so on. So there was some level of appreciation of their culture, but the oil extraction, what the extractivist targets were the most important. there were cases of indigenous people working for the industries, but they were really rare. Because actually the working in the oil and gas industries was gate kept heavily. Like it was really at some point desired, because the salaries in these regions were 4 times higher than salaries in other oil regions because of the kind of challenges. And so it was, to begin with, hard to get into the kind of rotational group. Once it's formed, people were really gatekeeping the entry. From one documentary movie, but from a post-Soviet period, the ethnographer Van Golovnev, he was working with the indigenous couple and documenting their life in their farm. And at one point, the husband, he got employed at the one of the industrial enterprises related to oil production, but then he left. He left it and returned to his lifestyle in his settlement, which was being at the same time encroached by more and more extraction. So there would be different scenarios. So there were a lot of reports of indigenous people missing or being killed for unknown reasons, and there were, for instance, they were sometimes accidents with all-terrain vehicles that would hit the humans in the forest. So at least I saw one of such case in the press clippings that I've analyzed. So there would be cases of cooperation between oil workers and indigenous communities where they would, for instance, share resources with each other. So there would be really a lot of different scenarios. And of course, there was always like room for negotiation, but the overall trend was that the priority was given to extractive industries. And according to the decree on land, so one of the first decrees that Soviet Union introduced was that actually like all land is nationalized, including patrimonial land. There was no concept of patrimonial lands in the Soviet Union until 1992. So there was no legal tool to kind of legally argue against it. And yet there could be a lot of scenarios of interaction between settlers and indigenous communities. So there wasn't one story.
Okay, I think we already, overstretched the timetable a bit. But I think if there's one last question, we can ask it now. Everything said. So we are here, and Ksenija is here, and for further questions, I guess. So thank you very much again for sharing your research in this stage, and I think we can all very much look forward to further future results and lectures by you. And thank you all for coming here, and wish you a nice evening.
And thanks so much for